Chuck Norris, the unshakable titan of martial arts cinema, the man whose very name became synonymous with invincibility, rose from the ashes of poverty and loss to become one of the most recognized action heroes the world has ever known. With fists that shattered boards and a gaze that commanded respect, he dominated screens in Walker, Texas Ranger, Missing in Action, and the Delta Force, carving his legend into the bedrock of American pop culture. For decades, he stood as the embodiment of strength itself, a warrior who never blinked, never faltered, never broke. But behind that iron exterior lies a story far more devastating than any villain he ever faced on screen. Childhood trauma that left scars no black belt could heal, losses that brought the indestructible man to his knees, and battles fought not in dojos, but in the suffocating darkness of his own mind. And before we begin, if Chuck Norris was ever a hero of yours, don't forget to hit like as a tribute to the man who taught us that even legends bleed. It is heartbreaking to realize that the man who would become a symbol of unbreakable strength entered this world carrying a weight no child should ever bear. Carlos Ray Norris was born on March 10, 1940 in Ryan, Oklahoma, a town so small it barely registered on maps. A place where dust settled on dreams and poverty clung to families like a second skin. His father, Ray Norris, was a mechanic whose hands were more familiar with whiskey bottles than wrenches, a man whose demons chased him relentlessly. His mother, Wilma, worked as a housewife, stretching pennies until they screamed, her quiet resilience the only steady force in a home that trembled with uncertainty. Chuck had two younger brothers, Wieland and Aaron, three boys who learned early that survival meant silence. The Norris household carried a different kind of brutality, the slow suffocation of neglect, the ache of a father who was present in body, but absent in spirit. Ray Norris disappeared into his addictions, leaving his sons to navigate childhood without a compass. Chuck would later recall the nights when his father stumbled through the door, the air thick with disappointment, the way his mother's shoulders would sag under the weight of another broken promise. There was no screaming, but there was something worse: silence. The kind of silence that swallows hope, that teaches a child love is conditional. At school, the cruelty continued. Chuck was small for his age, painfully shy, his clothing worn thin. The other boys sensed weakness the way wolves sense injured prey. They mocked his poverty, his quietness, his inability to fight back. Lunchrooms became battlefields. Hallways echoed with laughter designed to remind him he didn't belong. Every day he walked to school carrying not just books, but shame. Every day he returned home to a father who couldn't see him and a mother who loved him but couldn't shield him from the world's cruelty. The wound that branded Chuck's soul deepest came from the accumulation of invisibility. He was the boy nobody noticed, the son his father forgot, the student teachers overlooked. In a world that celebrated strength, Chuck Norris was painfully, devastatingly weak. And he knew it. The shame became his constant companion, whispering that he would never be enough, that he was destined to remain small, forgotten, powerless. But even in that darkness, something was forming, a quiet rage, a determination that if the world wouldn't see him, he would force it to. The child who trembled in hallways carried within him a spark that refused to die, a spark that would one day ignite into something the world could not ignore. In 1958, at the age of 18, Chuck Norris stood at a crossroads that would redefine everything. The shy, invisible boy from Oklahoma had joined the United States Air Force, desperate for escape, for structure, for anything that might give his life meaning beyond the suffocating poverty and neglect he'd known. The military offered discipline, but it also offered something unexpected, a ticket to South Korea, where fate placed before him a doorway he never knew existed. On the base, he watched fellow airmen practicing Tang Soo Do, a Korean martial art that moved like poetry, written in violence, where strength was not just physical, but spiritual, where the weak could be transformed into warriors. For the first time in his life, Chuck felt something stir inside him that wasn't shame. It was hope. He began training with quiet intensity, the same invisibility that had haunted his childhood now becoming his greatest asset. While others talked, he practiced. While others celebrated, he drilled techniques until his knuckles bled and his legs trembled. The dojo became his sanctuary, the place where the frightened boy could be left at the door, and something harder, something unbreakable, could be forged in sweat and repetition. His instructors noticed what others had always overlooked. Beneath the quiet exterior lived a hunger that could not be satisfied. By the time Chuck returned to the United States in the early 1960s, he carried with him a black belt and something far more valuable, proof that he could become more than the world had decided he was. But America didn't care about a nobody with a black belt. He worked at Northrop Aviation, a job that paid bills but suffocated dreams, and at night he taught martial arts classes in his mother's backyard, charging $5 per student to anyone who would come. The classes were small, the money barely enough to survive, but each student represented something larger, validation that what he had learned mattered. The breakthrough arrived not with thunderous applause, but with a single tournament. In 1964, Chuck entered his first karate competition, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone could hear it. Years later, he would admit that stepping onto that mat terrified him more than any enemy ever would. But when the match began, something extraordinary happened. The techniques he'd practiced 10,000 times flowed without thought. His body moved while his mind watched, astonished. He won. And then he won again. Tournament after tournament fell before him, each victory chipping away at the invisible boy's ghost, until what remained was a champion. The boy from Oklahoma was now becoming the warrior the world couldn't ignore. The rise was unstoppable. By 1968, Chuck Norris held the title of professional middleweight karate champion, a crown he would defend for 6 consecutive years, undefeated, untouchable. Tournament after tournament fell before him. The All-American Karate Championship, the International Karate Championship, the World Middleweight Karate Championship. His name became synonymous with dominance in martial arts circles, whispered with reverence in dojos across America. Students lined up to train under him. His karate schools multiplied across California. Money that had once been a stranger to the Norris family now flowed steadily, transforming the boy who wore hand-me-downs into a man who could finally breathe without the weight of poverty crushing his chest. But Chuck understood that tournament victories, however glorious, had a ceiling. The world of competitive karate was small, insular, invisible to mainstream America. He watched as Bruce Lee, a friend and occasional training partner, began breaking into Hollywood, shattering barriers and proving that martial artists could be more than fighters. They could be icons. In 1972, fate knocked. Lee himself called, offering Chuck a role as the villain in Return of the Dragon. The decision terrified him. Acting meant exposure, vulnerability, stepping into an arena where his fists couldn't protect him. But he said yes. The fight scene between Chuck Norris and Bruce Lee in the Roman Colosseum became legendary, watched by millions, dissected by fans, immortalized in cinema history. Chuck's performance was raw, authentic, powerful. He wasn't acting, he was being himself, a warrior who understood combat at a cellular level. Suddenly, Hollywood noticed. Offers trickled in, small roles, then larger ones. Breaker. In 1977 gave him his first leading role. Good Guys Wear Black in 1978 proved he could carry a film. By 1980, The Octagon cemented his status as an action star audiences would pay to watch. But with every premiere, every interview, every autograph signed, the pressure mounted. Chuck was no longer just a martial artist. He was a symbol, an image, a product that had to be maintained. The studios demanded more. More films, more interviews, more of himself than he knew how to give. Sleep became a luxury. Family dinners became schedule conflicts. The quiet boy who had once found peace in the dojang now lived in the chaos of fame, where every moment was scrutinized, every word analyzed. At night, alone in hotel rooms between film shoots, he still felt the ghost of that invisible child, now amplified by the terror that one day the world would see through the image and discover he was still just Carlos, still just the frightened boy pretending to be strong. In 1988, at the height of his action star dominance, the facade cracked in a way Chuck Norris never anticipated. For years, he had been building an empire. Films, television deals, endorsements. But behind the scenes, his first marriage to Diane Holchek was crumbling. They had married young in 1958, two kids from humble backgrounds who believed love could survive anything. For 3 decades, Diane had been his anchor, raising their sons, Mike and Eric, while Chuck chased championships and movie stardom. But distance is a cruel destroyer. The long months on location, the endless promotional tours, the relentless demands of fame, all of it created an ocean between them that no amount of success could bridge. The breaking point came not with explosive arguments, but with suffocating silence. Phone calls grew shorter, colder. When Chuck returned home between films, he found himself a stranger in his own house, speaking a language his family no longer understood. Diane had built a life around his absence, learning to be both mother and father, and when he returned, there was no space left for him. The guilt was crushing. He was providing everything materially, the mansion, the security, the comfort, yet he had failed to provide the one thing that mattered most: presence. The boy who had grown up with an absent father had become exactly what he swore he would never be. But there was something darker beneath the surface, something Chuck carried in shame for years. In 1964, while still married to Diane, he had fathered a daughter, Dina, with another woman. He kept this secret buried, hidden from his family, from the public, from the image of the wholesome American hero he had carefully constructed. The weight of that secret pressed down on him like concrete, making every interview feel like a lie, every family photo feel like a betrayal. When the truth finally emerged years later, the revelation shattered whatever remained of his first marriage's foundation. By 1989, the divorce was finalized. 30 years of marriage dissolved into legal documents and divided assets. For Chuck, the failure was not just personal. It was the confirmation of his deepest fear, that despite all his strength, all his championships, all his fame, he was still that powerless boy from Oklahoma who couldn't protect what mattered most. His sons looked at him with questions he couldn't answer. His daughter Dina existed in the shadows of his shame. And the man the world saw as invincible discovered that there are battles no amount of physical strength can win. This was not just the end of a marriage. It was the collapse of the illusion that success could heal the wounds of childhood, that fame could make you whole. In the aftermath of his divorce, Chuck Norris faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could retreat into bitterness, or he could rebuild. At 49 years old, with his personal life in shambles and the guilt of his failures pressing down like a vice, he chose to fight. But this battle required weapons he had never wielded before: honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to face what he had become. The man who had spent his entire life building armor now had to learn how to remove it, piece by painful piece. Recovery demanded confronting the truth about Dina, his daughter born from his affair. For years, she had existed in the shadows of his shame, a secret he had buried beneath the image of the wholesome action hero. In the early 1990s, Chuck made the agonizing decision to publicly acknowledge her existence. The revelation sent shockwaves through his carefully constructed public image. Fans who had idolized him as the embodiment of traditional American values felt betrayed. The media circled like vultures. But for Chuck, the exposure was its own kind of liberation. He could finally stop running from the truth. Slowly, painfully, he began rebuilding relationships that had fractured under the weight of his absence and lies. He reached out to Dina, attempting to forge a connection with the daughter he had denied. He worked to repair bonds with his sons Mike and Eric, who had watched their family implode and struggled to reconcile the father they knew with the man the world was discovering. The conversations were brutal, filled with tears and accusations and questions that had no good answers. But Chuck showed up. Day after day, he chose presence over pride, honesty over image. In 1998, Chuck married Gina O'Kelly, a former model, 23 years his junior. To skeptics, it looked like a midlife crisis, another Hollywood cliché. But to Chuck, Gina represented a second chance, an opportunity to build something different. With her, he vowed to be the husband he had failed to be before. Present, honest, vulnerable. They had twins in 2001, and at 61 years old, Chuck held his newborn children with hands that trembled, terrified of repeating the failures of his first marriage, determined to be the father these children deserved. But recovery is never linear. The ghosts of absence and shame still haunted him. There were nights when he lay awake, replaying every moment he had missed with his older children, every lie he had told to protect his image. What returned from the wreckage of 1989 was not the invincible action hero, but something more human, a man scarred by his choices, humbled by his failures, still searching for redemption one day at a time. The 1990s belonged to Chuck Norris in a way few decades ever belonged to anyone. While his personal life had required painful reconstruction, his professional empire reached heights that seemed impossible for the shy boy from Oklahoma. In 1993, Walker, Texas Ranger premiered on CBS, and what was meant to be a simple action series became a cultural phenomenon that would run for 8 seasons and 203 episodes. As Cordell Walker, Chuck embodied everything Americans wanted to believe about justice, a man who could solve problems with honor, strength, and an unwavering moral compass. The show dominated Saturday nights, pulling in millions of viewers who saw in Walker not just entertainment, but a hero in an increasingly complicated world. The money followed the fame like a tidal wave. At his peak, Chuck earned over $1 million per episode, transforming the financial anxiety of his childhood into distant memory. He purchased a sprawling ranch in Texas, complete with horses, land stretching to the horizon, and a peace he had never known in his younger years. Private security, luxury vehicles, investments that multiplied. Everything his parents could never afford now sat within his reach. To a generation, Chuck Norris was not just an action star. He was proof that hard work and discipline could rewrite destiny. But success is a jealous companion. The shooting schedule for Walker was relentless. 12 to 16-hour days, 6 days a week, for 8 consecutive years. Chuck performed most of his own stunts, his body absorbing punishment that would have hospitalized younger men. His knees ached constantly. His back stiffened each morning, requiring longer warm-ups just to move normally. Nights offered little rest, his mind racing with the demands of being not just the star, but also a producer, responsible for hundreds of cast and crew members whose livelihoods depended on the show's success. Relationships suffered under the weight of the schedule. Dinners with Gina became phone calls from set. Time with his young twins became stolen moments between scenes. He was providing everything materially, building an empire for his family. Yet the ghost of his first marriage whispered warnings he tried desperately to ignore. This time would be different, he told himself. This time he was older, wiser, more present. But the clock cared nothing for intentions, and the hours he spent building his legend were hours stolen from the people who needed him most. Glory had arrived, draped in ratings and revenue. But glory, Chuck was learning once again, demanded sacrifice that could never truly be repaid. The cost was invisible to cameras, but he felt it in every missed bedtime story, every promise to be there next time that echoed the absent father he had sworn never to become. In 1998, Chuck Norris believed he had found redemption in the form of Gino Kelly, a former model whose grace and strength seemed to offer him the second chance he desperately needed. Their meeting came at a charity event, and the connection was immediate. Not the fiery passion of youth, but something deeper, steadier, born from the wisdom of mistakes already made. Gina was 23 years younger, but she saw past the action hero facade to the man still carrying childhood wounds. When they married that year, Chuck made vows he swore would be different. This time, he would be present. This time, he would not let ambition steal what mattered most. For a time, it seemed as though he might succeed. In 2001, at the age of 61, Gina gave birth to twins, Dakota and Danilee. Chuck held those babies with trembling hands, his heart swelling with both joy and terror. He had been given another chance at fatherhood, an opportunity to be the father he had failed to be, for Mike, Eric, and Dina. He reduced his workload, spent more time at the ranch, coached his children's activities, and showed up in ways he never had before. The cameras captured moments of domestic bliss. Chuck at soccer games, Chuck reading bedtime stories, Chuck finally mastering the art of presence. But distance crept in through different doors. The age gap between Chuck and Gina, once irrelevant in the glow of new love, began casting shadows as years passed. She was navigating motherhood and middle age, while he was confronting the reality of growing old. Their worlds moved at different speeds, their needs pulling in opposite directions. The long nights on set during Walker, Texas Ranger had ended, but they were replaced by different absences. Speaking engagements, business obligations, the weight of maintaining an empire that demanded constant attention. The fractures deepened when Gina's health began to deteriorate in 2013 after a routine MRI. She experienced debilitating symptoms that doctors struggled to explain, and Chuck watched helplessly as the woman who had given him redemption suffered in ways he couldn't fix with strength or fame. He became her caregiver, her advocate, fighting medical establishments with the same intensity he once brought to tournaments. But the stress exposed fault lines that had always existed beneath the surface. Unspoken resentments, unmet needs, the exhaustion of two people trying to hold together what time and circumstance kept pulling apart. By the 2000s, whispers circulated that the marriage carried weight neither would publicly acknowledge. They remained together, bound by children and decades of shared history. But the fairy tale had faded. What remained was something more complicated. Two people who had tried, who had loved, but who discovered that even second chances come with expiration dates neither can control. In 2005, the unthinkable happened. After 8 seasons of dominance, CBS canceled Walker, Texas Ranger, and the empire Chuck had built brick by brick began to show cracks. What was meant to be a graceful transition into the next chapter of his career became a harsh lesson in Hollywood's cruelty. The industry that had once fought for his signature now answered his calls with polite rejections. Scripts arrived that insulted his intelligence, cheap knockoffs of his former glory, roles that reduced him to parody. Studios wanted the Chuck Norris they remembered from the 1990s, but the man offering himself was now 65, moving slower, carrying decades of stunt work and joints that screamed with every kick. The project that was supposed to revive his relevance, The Cutter in 2005, collapsed spectacularly. Critics savaged it as outdated, a relic from an era cinema had outgrown. Box office numbers were embarrassing. The film disappeared from theaters within weeks, relegated to bargain bins alongside forgotten action stars who had once commanded millions. For Chuck, watching his face stare back from discount DVDs was more than professional disappointment. It was confirmation of his deepest fear, that he had always been expendable, that the world had simply been waiting for permission to forget him. Social media erupted with a different kind of attention entirely. Chuck Norris facts became an internet phenomenon in the mid-2000s. Jokes about his supposed invincibility, his ability to count to infinity twice, his tears curing cancer. Millions laughed. Memes spread globally. But the decision backfired in ways Chuck never anticipated. The jokes, meant as homage, reduced him to caricature. He was no longer an actor or martial artist, but a punchline. A nostalgic joke for a generation that had never watched his films seriously. Studios saw the memes and decided he was too cartoonish for legitimate roles, too tied to internet humor to be taken seriously as a dramatic actor. Offers dried up completely. The phone stopped ringing. Agents who once returned calls immediately now took days to respond with vague promises. Chuck found himself in a position he hadn't experienced since the 1960s, irrelevant, overlooked, forgotten by an industry that had once needed him. He watched younger action stars, Jason Statham, Dwayne Johnson, Liam Neeson, claim the space he had pioneered, their careers thriving while his collected dust. At night, in the silence of his ranch, the humiliation was suffocating. He had fought his entire life to be seen, to matter, to prove the invisible boy from Oklahoma could become legendary. And now, at the peak of his years, Hollywood had decided it was done with him. This wasn't just failure, it was erasure. The cruelest fate for a man who had spent his life fighting to be remembered. The body keeps score, and by the 2000s, Chuck Norris's body was demanding payment for decades of punishment. At 70 years old, the man who had performed his own stunts, absorbed countless blows in tournaments, and trained with an intensity that bordered on obsession began to feel the weight of every sacrifice. His knees, battered by tens of thousands of kicks, ached with a persistence that no amount of ice or rest could quiet. His shoulders, strained from years of grappling and throws, stiffened each morning until movement became a negotiation with pain. Sleep offered no escape. His back seized in the night, waking him with jolts that left him gasping in the darkness. But the crisis that shattered his sense of invincibility came not from his own body, but from watching Gina suffer. In 2013, she underwent routine MRI scans with contrast agents containing gadolinium, a heavy metal used to enhance imaging. Within hours of the procedure, Gina's body began shutting down in ways doctors couldn't explain. Burning sensations raced through her limbs. Her cognitive function deteriorated. Muscle weakness left her unable to perform basic tasks. She described feeling as though her body was being poisoned from the inside, and Chuck watched helplessly as the woman who had given him a second chance at love withered before his eyes. Doctors dismissed her symptoms, suggesting anxiety or psychosomatic responses. But Chuck knew better. He had spent his life reading opponents, recognizing when something was deeply, terribly wrong. He became her warrior in a different kind of fight, researching gadolinium toxicity, finding specialists who would listen, spending millions on treatments that insurance refused to cover. The man who had faced down villains on screen now faced a medical establishment that treated his wife's suffering as inconvenient and unbelievable. The frustration was maddening, the helplessness more devastating than any physical defeat he had ever endured. The experience forced Chuck to confront mortality in ways fame had allowed him to avoid. He was no longer the indestructible action hero. He was a man in his 70s watching his wife suffer, feeling his own body betray him, understanding with brutal clarity that strength has limits time will not respect. Health, he realized, was not something that could be earned through discipline or maintained through willpower alone. It was fragile, unpredictable, and when it failed, no amount of championships or box office records could buy it back. The lesson was devastating. You can conquer the world and still lose everything that matters. And sometimes, the cruelest battles are the ones where fighting harder makes no difference at all. In 2001, Chuck Norris faced the cruelest loss a parent can endure. His daughter, Dina, the child born from his affair in 1964, the daughter he had kept secret for years before finally acknowledging, died in a car accident. She was just 37 years old. The news arrived like a bullet he never saw coming, tearing through the carefully constructed armor he had spent decades building. For Chuck, who had already carried the weight of her existence as his deepest shame, her death became an unbearable reckoning with all the years he had stolen from both of them. Dinah had grown up knowing her father was Chuck Norris, the action hero whose face appeared on billboards and movie posters, yet for most of her childhood, she existed in the shadows of his denial. When he finally acknowledged her publicly in the 1990s, they had attempted to build a relationship from the ruins of lost time. But how do you compress 30 years of fatherhood into a few short years? How do you apologize for birthdays missed, for school plays unattended, for the fundamental absence that shaped a child's entire understanding of her own worth? They tried. Chuck showed up, finally, attempting to be present in ways he had failed to be during her formative years. The moment of loss arrived without warning. One phone call, and suddenly all the conversations they had planned would never happen. All the apologies he still owed her would remain unspoken. The guilt was suffocating, relentless. Chuck attended her funeral carrying not just grief, but the crushing weight of everything he could never repair. He had spent her childhood protecting his image, and now that image stood as a monument to his failure as a father. While cameras captured his public persona as a hero, his daughter had grown up wondering why she wasn't worth claiming, why her father's career mattered more than her existence. The grief process was brutal and lonely. In public, Chuck remained the stoic warrior, but in private, the tears came without permission, arriving at unexpected moments, during interviews when someone mentioned family, at premieres when he saw fathers with daughters, in the silent hours before dawn when sleep refused to come. His wife Gina held him through the worst nights, but even her presence couldn't fill the void Dina's death had carved into his soul. Something in him had broken that could never be repaired. The strongest man in the world discovered that there are wounds no strength can heal, losses that make invincibility a cruel joke, and regrets that follow you into every tomorrow, whispering what you can never undo. By the mid-2000s, Chuck Norris knew something had to change. At 75 years old, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of his Texas ranch, he no longer recognized the man looking back. The action hero was gone. The tournament champion was a memory. What remained was a father haunted by the daughter he had lost, a husband watching his wife suffer, and a man whose body was surrendering to time despite a lifetime spent defying it. The turning point came not through epiphany, but through exhaustion. The simple, devastating realization that he could not outrun his regrets, could not fight his way past grief, could not kick hard enough to change what he had become. The transformation began with honesty. Chuck started speaking publicly about his failures as a father, admitting in interviews that his pursuit of glory had cost him relationships that could never be recovered. He talked about Dine, about the years of denial, about the shame that had poisoned what little time they had together. The admissions were excruciating, each word feeling like pulling shrapnel from an old wound. But the exposure brought its own kind of relief. He was no longer performing invincibility. He was simply being human. He redirected his energy toward causes that honored the pain he carried. Gina's health crisis became his mission. Chuck founded organizations to raise awareness about gadolinium toxicity, spending millions of his own fortune-funding research and supporting victims whose suffering had been dismissed by the medical establishment. The lawsuits he filed weren't about money. They were about validation, about refusing to let his wife's pain be treated as invisible. For a man who had built his career on physical strength, advocating through persistence and visibility became a different kind of warrior's path. Family became the arena where he fought his most important battles. He worked to deepen relationships with his sons Mike and Eric, sitting through difficult conversations about his absences. During their childhood, listening without defending, apologizing without expecting forgiveness. With his twins, Dakota and Danny Lee, now teenagers, he showed up relentlessly. Every game, every recital, every moment he could steal from the demands that had once seemed so urgent. The world no longer roared his name, but his children knew their father was present, and that mattered more than any applause. Critics noticed something different in the few roles he accepted. There was vulnerability now, a willingness to play characters who were tired, flawed, wrestling with their own demons. The old Chuck Norris would have rejected such roles as weakness. But transformation had taught him that strength without honesty is just performance, and he was done performing. What emerged was not the invincible hero, but something rarer, a man courageous enough to carry his scars in daylight. Today, at 84 years old, Chuck Norris lives a life that would have seemed impossible to the invisible boy from Oklahoma. The sprawling ranch in Texas remains his sanctuary, a place where the noise of fame fades into the quiet rhythm of horses, open land, and sunrises that ask nothing of him except presence. The pace has slowed dramatically. Gone are the 16-hour days on set, the relentless tournament circuits, the exhausting promotional tours. What remains is simpler, quieter, built around family dinners and the discipline of aging with dignity rather than desperation. With a fortune estimated between $70 and $80 million, financial security allows Chuck the luxury his parents never knew: the freedom to choose purpose over profit. He selects projects sparingly now, appearing occasionally in commercials or small film roles that honor his legacy without demanding the physical toll his body can no longer pay. His knees require careful management. His back reminds him daily of every stunt he performed without doubles. Mornings begin with stretches that take longer than they used to, movements that are more maintenance than mastery. Relationships once fractured have found their own form of peace. His sons Mike and Eric, now men in their 50s and 60s, have built their own lives, carrying forward lessons learned from both their father's presence and his absence. The twins, Dakota and Danny Lee, now in their 20s, grew up with a father who showed up. Not the invincible action hero the world worshipped, but the man who chose them over glory. With Gina, the marriage has weathered storms that would have destroyed weaker bonds. Her health remains fragile, requiring ongoing vigilance and care, and Chuck has become the caregiver he once needed others to be for him. Health remains the constant negotiation. Regular checkups are no longer optional, but essential. Diet and exercise continue, not for vanity, but for survival. The understanding that discipline at 84 is the difference between independence and helplessness. When asked about regrets, Chuck speaks with the honesty age has granted him. There are many, too many to count, but dwelling in them serves no one. The days are quieter now, stripped of the thunder that once defined him. But in that quiet, Chuck has found something the roar of stadiums never offered. The peace of a man who finally stopped running from the boy he used to be and learned, slowly and painfully, to forgive him. Few lives illustrate the paradox of American success like Chuck Norris's journey from invisible poverty to global icon. Over 6 decades in the public eye, he starred in more than 30 films, dominated competitive karate for 6 consecutive years as undefeated champion, and led a television series that ran 203 episodes across 8 seasons. The numbers are staggering, but they tell only part of the story. To a generation raised in the 1980s and 1990s, Chuck Norris was more than entertainment. He was proof that strength could be cultivated, that the weak could become warriors. The transformation was possible for anyone willing to endure the pain of change. He changed action cinema by proving martial artists could be leading men, paving the way for Jackie Chan, Jet Li, and countless others who followed. His influence extended beyond film into popular culture itself. The Chuck Norris facts phenomenon, however much it reduced him to caricature, demonstrated a cultural penetration few actors ever achieve. MMA fighters cite him as inspiration. Karate schools across America still display his photograph on their walls. But history will debate whether his greatest contribution was his art or his embodiment of a particularly American mythology. The self-made man who conquered weakness through discipline. The scandals, the mistakes, the failures, all of it adds necessary dimension to a legacy that could have been sterile perfection. His affair and the daughter he denied reveal the cost of protecting image over embracing truth. His first marriage's collapse exposes the lie that success can substitute for presence. His professional setbacks in the 2000s demonstrate that fame is temporary, that industries discard even legends when they're no longer profitable. These failures don't diminish his achievements. They humanize them, proving that even the strongest among us carry wounds that never fully heal. What survives time is not the invincibility, but the persistence. Audiences remember not just the roundhouse kicks, but the quiet determination, the refusal to stay down, even when life delivered blows no stunt coordinator choreographed. What endures is the image of a man who started with nothing, no wealth, no confidence, no belief the world would ever see him, and forced it to look anyway. But the price was steep, relationships sacrificed, a daughter lost to both secrecy and death, a body broken by decades of proving himself. Health crises that revealed invincibility was always illusion. That he still stands at 84, humbled but unbroken, is its own kind of victory. Chuck Norris's life proves that strength without vulnerability is performance, that glory without sacrifice is fantasy, and that the truest battles are never the ones captured on film, but the ones fought in the mirror each morning when you face who you've become. At 85, Chuck Norris carries the weight of a life lived in extremes, triumph and tragedy bound together so tightly they've become inseparable. From the invisible boy in Oklahoma who couldn't defend himself to the martial arts champion who conquered tournaments to the action icon who dominated screens worldwide, he has traveled a road paved with both glory and devastating loss. The black belts and box office records may shine in retrospect, but the soul carries scars that no applause could ever heal. A daughter lost to secrecy and death, marriages fractured by ambition, a body broken by the very strength that defined him. His story reminds us that even legends bleed, that invincibility is always illusion, and that the fiercest battles are fought not against villains, but against our own demons. If Chuck Norris was ever part of your childhood, what memories do you carry of the man who taught us resilience? Share your thoughts below. Leave a like as tribute to a warrior who proved that survival, not perfection, is the truest victory.